Hello. Write in the comments where you're from. Don't forget to subscribe and hit like. Enjoy the story. You can't hide your country ways even in a fancy restaurant. Sarah's mother-in-law shouted across the family dinner. Right after that, her husband spit into her plate and ordered her to leave. But they had no idea that her father, the man they thought was just a poor villager, was actually the owner of the restaurant. When he saw her tears, he silently walked up to the table. What he placed on their plates afterward made them regret their actions for the rest of their lives. The restaurant was called Bear's Retreat, the most expensive, most pretentious place in Chicago. A place people didn't just go to eat, but to be seen, close a deal, and show off their status. Sarah was there for the first time. She had felt out of place the moment the doorman in his livery opened the heavy oak door for her. Inside, everything was overwhelming. Dim lighting, soft music, the clinking of glasses. At every table sat people whose outfits cost more than her yearly salary before marriage. The Harrisons were celebrating. Wade and his mother Margaret had just signed a big construction contract. Sarah didn't care about the details. Her role was to sit quietly, smile, and look like a pretty accessory. Her mother-in-law was in her element. In a strict black dress with a strand of large pearls around her neck, she had already given Sarah a frosty look back in the car. "I hope you know how to behave yourself," she had thrown instead of a greeting. Sarah stayed silent. Arguing with Margaret was like trying to stop a train with bare hands. They sat at a reserved table by the window with a view of Chicago at night. Wade looked pleased. He unbuttoned his tailored jacket and leaned back, his sense of pride amplified by his mother's presence. The evening began with small jabs. Sarah picked up the wrong fork. Margaret gave a dramatic sigh and slid the cutlery into place. Sarah reached for the bread basket. "In polite society, Sarah, you wait until it's offered," Margaret hissed through her teeth. Sarah glanced at Wade. He pretended to study the menu, his eyes glued to the list of French dishes. He wasn't going to defend her. He never did. The appetizers arrived. Sarah had ordered a simple salad. She was afraid to make a mistake. "Of course," Margaret smirked, poking at an oyster. "What else would someone raised on potatoes order? A pull to the dirt can't be erased." Wade chuckled. That laugh was worse than an insult. It meant he was on his mother's side, and she was the outsider. Sarah felt her food lodge in her throat. She wanted to get up and leave, but she thought of Mike, their 7-year-old son. She had to endure it for him. Trying to change the subject, she said, "Mike drew the funniest little tank today, with flowers instead of a cannon." Margaret slowly set her fork down. The sound of porcelain against porcelain cracked like a gunshot. "We're discussing $1 million contract, and you bring up children's doodles. Do you even realize where you are? Your place is with pots and crayons. Don't insert yourself into the world of serious people." Sarah wanted to reply, but the words stuck in her throat. She looked at Wade again. His eyes held only irritation directed at her. Her hands trembled. She reached for her water glass and accidentally knocked her napkin onto the carpet. For Margaret, that was the final straw. "Clumsy. You're always like this. Can't do anything right. I told Wade marrying you was a mistake. A peasant girl. Dress you in gold, bring you to the finest restaurant. It doesn't matter. You can't hide your country ways even here." The words carried across the room. Sarah froze. Her ears rang as she felt dozens of curious stares. She turned to her husband with one last silent plea, "Protect me." Wade looked at her. He saw her tears. He saw her humiliation. And then he made his choice. He leaned over her plate of salad and spit. Thick, deliberate, with disgust. Right in the middle. For Sarah, the world shrank to that spit. All other sounds vanished. 10 years of marriage were destroyed by that single gesture. "Get out," he said coldly. At that moment, she noticed movement. A man was approaching their table. Tall, silver-haired, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. Waiters stepped aside for him. Margaret frowned when she saw him. Probably the manager, coming to scold them for making a scene. But the man stopped at their table, his eyes fixed only on Sarah. And she recognized him. It was her father, Michael. The same father the Harrisons thought was just a poor widower from the countryside. He rarely visited, always dressed plainly. Sarah herself never really knew what he did for a living. He always said he ran a small business. But now he stood here, looking every inch the owner of this place. His face was unreadable. Only a deep sadness flickered in his eyes as he looked at his daughter. Slowly, he shifted his gaze to Margaret and Wade. They stared back, puzzled. Michael raised his hand and made a subtle gesture to a waiter. At once, the waiter hurried over with a stack of clean plates. Michael took one, perfectly white, gleaming. With calm precision, he set the empty plate in the center of the table. The sound of porcelain on wood was soft, yet final. Margaret and Wade stared at the empty plate. They had no idea what was happening. But Sarah did. She understood everything in that blinding whiteness. There was no forgiveness in her father's eyes. That plate was a declaration of war. Michael gave another signal, and the waiter placed a folded sheet of paper on the plate. "If you're the manager, then I demand the complaint book," Margaret finally snapped. "Read," Michael cut her off, directing the word to Wade. Wade looked at his mother, confused. Michael picked up the paper himself and unfolded it before them. It was a legal document, a demand for immediate repayment of loans, with a detailed list beneath it, item by item. The down payment on their 3-bedroom condo. Sarah had always thought the Harrison savings paid for it. The car. Wade had claimed it was a work bonus. The funds to start Harrison construction. The medical bills, the spa treatment in Colorado Springs for Margaret. Monthly transfers for personal expenses. The list filled the page. At the bottom was the total sum, astronomical for their family. Margaret gawked at the paper. "What nonsense is this? What help? We never asked you for anything. Those were gifts." "There were no gifts," Michael replied calmly. "There were loans. I gave money to my daughter, not to you, and I see exactly how you've treated my kindness." He turned his gaze to Wade. "You spat in my daughter's face. You spat into my soul." Then he looked at them both again. "From this moment on, all ties between us are cut. I demand full repayment within 24 hours. My lawyer will contact you tomorrow morning." He turned to Sarah. The ice in his eyes was gone. There was only pain and love. He held out his hand. "Come on, sweetheart." Margaret jumped up. "Who do you think you are? A penniless hick. We'll grind you into dust. Do you have any idea what kind of connections we have?" Michael didn't even look back. "Let's go," he said to Sarah. Sarah stood. She leaned on his arm, solid as rock. For the first time in years, she felt supported. Her humiliation was replaced by cold fury. They walked out under a buzz of whispers. The staff parted respectfully before her father. At the door, he draped her coat over her shoulders. "I need to go home," Sarah said firmly. "I need to get Mike." Her father saw steel, not tears, in her eyes. He nodded. "All right, call me as soon as you have my grandson." Sarah rode through the night streets of Chicago in a taxi. All she could see was her son Mike. She had to get him right away. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a victim, but like a force. The taxi stopped at her building. The courtyard was familiar, yet everything felt foreign now. She took the elevator up and pulled out her keys. She slid one into the lock. It wouldn't turn. She tried again. The key only went halfway and jammed. The lock had been changed. Cold sweat broke across her back. She rang the bell. Once, twice, 3 times. No answer. She started pounding on the door with her fist. "Wade, open up. I know you're in there." Silence. Then her eyes fell to the floor by the door. Her paintings were lying there. Her soul, her only escape from the gray life with the Harrisons. She had painted at night, landscapes from childhood, portraits. Now that world lay at her feet, trampled. Canvases ripped from their frames and crumpled. Some slashed with a knife. Mike's portrait shredded especially cruelly. Broken brushes, crushed tubes of paint scattered around. Sarah stared at it, and the air left her lungs. It was worse than the spit. They had crushed her soul. With shaking hands, she found Wade's number and pressed call. He picked up. "What else do you want?" "Wade, what's going on? Why did you change the lock? What happened to my paintings?" He chuckled. "Where else should they be? Trash belongs outside." "Mike, where's Mike? I want to take him." A short pause. Then Wade spoke the words that finished grinding her into the dirt. "You'll never see him again. A woman who walks out on her family in the middle of the night isn't a mother." He hung up. Sarah collapsed to her knees. The phone slipped from her hand. The horrifying truth seeped in. This was the plan. While she was in the taxi, they were already setting it up. They painted a picture. A hysterical wife stormed out, abandoning her child. Her son, her Mike, was now a hostage. What would they tell him? That his mom was bad? She found Dad in her phone and hit call. "Sasha? What happened?" "They changed the lock. I can't get in. They threw out my paintings." Wade said, "I'll never see Mike again. What do I do?" She heard his heavy breathing. Then his voice, calm and steady. "Where are you right now?" "In the hallway, outside the door." "Stay there. Don't move. Someone's coming for you." Sarah sank onto the steps. She gathered the ruined canvases and pressed them to her chest. She didn't cry. Her tears were gone. Inside, only a cold ember of rage remained. 20 minutes later, the downstairs door slammed, and steady footsteps echoed up the stairs. A man in his mid-40s appeared on the landing, dressed in a sharp suit, carrying a briefcase. "Sarah?" he asked in an even voice. "My name is Robert Martin. I'm your father's attorney. Michael asked me to take your case." He didn't offer to help her up. He acted not like a rescuer but like a surgeon. That gave her confidence. He didn't take her to a hotel but to an empty service apartment in the city center. "No one will find you here," Robert explained. "Now tell me everything. From the very beginning." Every word could matter. Sarah told him about the dinner, Margaret's words, Wade's spit, about her father's appearance and the document, about the lock in the paintings, about the call with her husband. Robert listened, jotting down notes. "The plan is clear," he finally said. "They created the picture of your abandonment. Tomorrow we'll file for custody determination. We have a witness, your father, the restaurant owner. That carries weight." The next morning they were at the courthouse. Robert confidently led her through the halls and filed the documents. A young clerk typed for a long time, then lifted her eyes in surprise. "There's already a countersuit filed by Wade Harrison. Registered last night." Robert frowned. "Can we see it?" He began reading, and Sarah saw his face harden. He silently handed the papers to her. It was Wade's statement, and it was a monstrous lie from start to finish. It said that his wife, Sarah Harrison, had long been unstable, that she suffered from bouts of unprovoked aggression, that on that night in the restaurant she had caused a public scene, shouted at his elderly mother, then stormed off in hysteria, abandoning her family. The worst part, attached was a police report. Apparently, right after Sarah left with her father, Margaret had called the police. The report stated, "Citizen Harrison M. and her son Harrison W. request protection from the aggressive behavior of Harrison S., who, in a state of nervous agitation, posed a danger to herself and others, including a minor child." "This is a lie," Sarah whispered. "I know," Robert said calmly, though a cold glint flashed in his eyes. "They prepared better than I thought. We'll break their case, but this is going to drag out." 2 days later, a preliminary hearing was scheduled. In a small office, at a long table, on one side sat Sarah and Robert. On the other, Wade, Margaret, and their attorney, a polished man with a smug smile. Wade didn't look at Sarah. Margaret drilled into her with eyes full of hatred and triumph. Robert spoke clearly, in sharp legal terms. He laid out the situation, pointed out the illegality of Wade's actions, and the psychological pressure from the mother-in-law. The Harrisons' lawyer listened with polite boredom, and when Robert finished, his smile grew wider. "That's all very touching, Mr. Martin. Your version of events certainly has the right to exist, but it has nothing to do with the legal side of this case." He pulled a document from his briefcase and set it on the table. "I believe this document will remove all questions about who the child should stay with." Robert took the paper. It wasn't a single sheet, but a thick bundle bound by a notary. Sarah stared at the blue cover, and a vague memory began to stir. She remembered that day. About 8 years ago, they were preparing to take out a mortgage. Wade had rushed home, flustered, shoving papers in her face. "Sarah, sign this quick. It's just a formality for the bank. They won't approve us without it. We're late." She'd been sick, running a fever. Margaret fussed around, handing her tea. "Sign, dear, don't hold your husband up." Sarah, without reading, had scrawled her name in several places Wade had marked with check marks. She trusted him. Completely. Robert flipped through the document. His face hardened. He stopped on one page, read it. Then read it again, slowly. He lifted his eyes to Sarah, and for the first time she saw uncertainty there. "What is it?" she whispered. He silently turned the paper toward her. It was a prenuptial agreement, the very one she had signed 8 years ago. Her eyes fell on section 4.3, highlighted in bold. In the event of divorce initiated by or caused by the wife, Sarah Harrison, as confirmed by her voluntary departure from the shared residence or any actions indicating dissolution of the family on her part, full and unconditional custody of all minor children automatically transfers to the husband, Wade Harrison. Sarah read the lines again and again. Automatically. Unconditional. Her fault. Her leaving the restaurant. All of it was now her fault. They had planned this. Not yesterday, years ago. It was a paper cage, and they had just slammed the door shut. Robert broke the silence first. He pushed the document aside. "We'll contest this. The terms are predatory. Clause 4.3 contradicts family law." He paused. "But it shows the intent of the other side and makes emergency measures harder. We'll have to prove your leaving was provoked." It meant only one thing, There would be no quick victory, and all that time, Mike would stay with them. The hearing ended without resolution. Child Services took time to review. Sarah wasn't allowed to see her son. They stepped out into a gray morning. Sarah felt hollow. "What now?" she asked. "Now we work," Robert said. "We gather evidence that your life in that family was unbearable." But Margaret wasn't going to wait. She struck next at Sarah's reputation. Sarah hid in the service apartment. Her phone rang nonstop with calls from acquaintances, from Mike's classmates' moms, from distant relatives. Every conversation was the same. "Sarah, what happened? Margaret called us, she's so worried." "Sarah, is it true you left Wade? And what about Mike?" Margaret worked methodically. She called everyone and spread her version. But it wasn't just lies, it was a brilliantly crafted half-truth. She twisted what mattered most to Sarah, her art, into a weapon. A few days later, Sarah's close friend Marina called. "Sarah, I don't know how to say this. I ran into your neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, and she told me that Margaret spoke to her, said you completely abandoned your family, that you locked yourself in a room for days painting, like you were obsessed. Wade came home from work, and the house was a mess, no dinner, and you sat there covered in paint, ignoring everyone." Sarah listened, her hands going cold. It was monstrous. She really had painted, but at night, when everyone was asleep. That was her personal time, her air. And now they painted it as a crime. "But that's not all, Sarah," Marina went on. "She said Mike was sick a lot, and you refused to stay with him. That you sent him to his grandmother's so he wouldn't bother your painting. And Margaret even showed photos." "What photos?" "Your room. The canvases, paints, brushes. She called it a den. Said, 'Look, this is the den where she hid from her own child.'" Sarah understood instantly. Those destroyed paintings in the hallway, they had been photographed first, turned into evidence of her obsession. It was the truth twisted inside out. Yes, she had a room with an easel, but they had turned her passion into a mental disorder. After that call, the phone went quiet. Friends stopped replying to her messages. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid her. She had become an outcast. There was one person who didn't believe a single word Margaret said. Her cousin Linda. They had grown up together in their grandmother's village. Linda was Sarah's complete opposite, sharp, pragmatic, a cybersecurity specialist. Linda arrived that very evening. "All right," she said, tossing her jacket off. "Got coffee? Start from the top. I need passwords." "What passwords?" "Everything. Email, socials, cloud. Yours, Wade's, that old witch's. Logins, birthdays. Anything that could be a key." "Linda, why?" "Because these bastards are playing dirty. Which means we're not going to play noble. They left digital footprints. I need to get into their messages. They must have discussed the plan. We need proof of collusion." All evening, Sarah racked her brain. Every password Wade might have used. They worked late into the night. Linda's fingers flew across the keyboard. "Got it," Linda said by morning. "I'm in their family cloud storage. Wade used the same password everywhere. Your wedding date. Ironic, huh?" She scrolled through folders. Documents, photos, work files. Mostly contracts, family pictures. Nothing incriminating. "They're not idiots," Linda muttered. "They didn't save the messages. Let's look for something else." She opened the folder called Miscellaneous. Inside were old instructions, books, and a few audio files with strange names. "What's this?" Linda clicked on the first file. From the speakers came a child's voice. Sarah's heart stopped. It was Mike. "Grandma, why is Mom crying?" he asked. Then Margaret's sweet voice followed. "She's not crying, sweetheart. She's just tired. She works a lot, paints her pictures. Those are more important to her than anything." Linda looked at Sarah. The fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by horror. She clicked on the next file. Again Mike's voice, but a different recording. "Grandma, does Mom love me?" And Margaret again. "Of course she loves you, my dear. Just in her own way. Artists are special people. They live in their own world. Sometimes they don't have time for us ordinary folks. Not even for their most precious boys." Sarah listened, her stomach turning. These were deliberate brainwashing sessions. Linda checked the file dates. The oldest one was over a year old. For a whole year, that woman had been dripping poison into her son's ears. She wasn't just turning him against his mother, she was tearing apart his very sense of security. Linda kept opening file after file. There were more than a dozen. Margaret had recorded her conversations with her grandson. Why? To use them? Or to savor her power? The last file was recorded just a few days ago. Mike's voice was tearful. I want my mom. Where's my mom? Margaret's voice was strict now, with no hint of sweetness. Your mom left. She chose her paintings over you. She abandoned you. But don't worry, I won't leave you. And your dad won't either. We love you more than she ever did. Linda snapped the laptop shut. Sarah was white as chalk, tears streaming down her face. This was worse than the prenup. They didn't just want to take her son physically, they were stealing his soul, erasing her from his heart, replacing her with the image of a monster. And they'd been doing it for a long time, patiently, with monstrous cruelty. Enough. That's it, Linda's voice was firm. Crying won't fix this. Sarah slowly lifted her eyes. They were empty. He won't believe me. Even if I see him, he won't believe a word I say. She's stolen him from me. Not his body, his soul. Then we'll get him back, Linda cut in. She pulled out a flash drive and an external hard drive. I'm copying this to 3 places. This is our trump card. That Robert better turn it into a bomb. She worked quickly. Sarah just sat there. In her ears rang Mike's voice. Does Mom love me? And Margaret's answer, of course she does. Just in her own way. That in her own way was worse than a straight no. It condemned a child to eternal doubt, to constantly searching for proof of his mother's love. They weren't just taking her son, they were trying to kill his love for her. Suddenly, the emptiness inside Sarah began to fill. Not with grief, but with fury. Cold, deadly fury. The fury of a mother whose child is being stolen. She stood up. Her legs shook, but she straightened. You're right. This is war. And I'm going to fight. Linda looked at her cousin with approval. Now that's more like it. Robert needs to see this right away. But it's going to be a long war. And expensive. Their lawyer costs a fortune. They'll bury us in paperwork. I have money, Sarah said. It was her secret. A personal account she'd opened before marriage. Royalties from sold paintings had trickled there, along with small transfers from her father, for pocket money. Over 10 years, the sum had grown nicely. I'll pay for everything myself, she said firmly. She wouldn't depend on her father. She would fight on her own. She grabbed her phone, opened her banking app, entered the password. The screen lit up. $0, 0 cents. Sarah blinked. Must be a glitch. She closed the app, reopened it. Same result. Balance, 0. A chill ran down her spine. She tried to check the transaction history. The page was blank. Panic rose in her throat. What is it? Linda asked. There's no money. The account's empty. She restarted the phone. Nothing changed. The emptiness stared back at her like hollow eye sockets of a skull. Call the bank, Linda ordered. Sarah found the hotline number. Her hands shook as she dialed. Finally, the call connected. Good afternoon, Progress Capital Bank. This is Natalie speaking. How may I help you? Hello. I have a problem with my account. It's showing 0. Name, please. Sarah gave it. Security word? Lilac, she whispered. The operator went silent. Only keyboard clicks could be heard. One moment, Sarah, let me check your file. Music played. Sarah clutched the phone. Every second stretched into eternity. Finally, a click. But the voice was different, male, official. Good afternoon, Sarah. This is branch manager Stephen Peterson. The operator passed along your case. Her heart plummeted. The branch manager. What happened to my account? All my savings were there. There's no error, Sarah. Your savings account was closed this morning. All funds withdrawn in cash at our main branch. Sarah gasped. Closed? By who? I didn't do this. A short pause. Then the manager delivered the nail in the coffin. The account was closed by your husband, Wade Harrison. The world tilted. But he had no right. That was my personal account, opened before the marriage. He acted under a general power of attorney issued in his name 3 years ago. That document gives him full authority to manage all your accounts. Power of attorney. Sarah desperately tried to remember. And then the memory surfaced. 3 years ago, Wade was heading to the tax office. Sarah, just sign this authorization, otherwise they won't accept the declaration without you. It's just a formality. She had been in a rush, getting Mike ready for daycare. She waved it off, signed without reading. She trusted him. The phone slipped from her hand. She stared at Linda with empty eyes. The financial noose had tightened. They hadn't just taken her son and crushed her reputation, they stripped her of the last thing left. Her final hope to fight. She was left utterly penniless, without a single cent. Linda picked up the phone. Sarah didn't hear a word. All she saw in her mind was the picture, her rushing, scribbling her signature on that paper for the tax office. Wade's trusting smile. Margaret's sweet words behind her. They'd staged a play, not improvising, but following a script written years before. Every careless signature she'd given had been another brick in the walls of her prison. Bastards, Linda hissed. They planned everything, down to the smallest detail. Sarah sank onto the couch. She laughed. A quiet, hysterical laugh. Laughed at her own stupidity, at her blind faith. For 10 years she had lived in a lie, thinking she was part of a family when she had only ever been a disposable resource. That evening she called her father. She hadn't wanted to burden him with this, but Linda insisted. He has to know. This isn't your fight anymore. It's a war between clans. Sarah told him everything. About the audio files, about how Margaret had been brainwashing Mike for a year, about the emptied bank account, about the power of attorney. She expected her father to shout, curse, explode in fury, but he listened silently. When she finished, there was a long silence on the line. Dad, are you there? I'm here, sweetheart, he answered. His voice was utterly calm, even weary. Don't worry. We'll sort out the money, and as for them, I'll handle it my way. That my way sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The next days were strangely quiet for Sarah. Robert, after receiving the flash drive from Linda, had erupted in fury. He said it changed everything. That now they had proof of systematic psychological abuse against the child. He was preparing a new, powerful lawsuit. But it would take time. Sarah lived in that temporary apartment like in a cocoon. Every day Linda brought her groceries and updates. The updates were grim. Margaret pressed on with her campaign. She managed to secure a temporary court order barring Sarah from approaching Mike's school, claiming her unstable mental state posed a risk. Sarah felt trapped. Every move she made was anticipated, every step countered by the Harrisons. She fought her small battles and kept losing. But she didn't know her father Michael had opened a second front, one the Harrisons never saw coming. At the office of Harrison Construction, the atmosphere grew tense. For 2 weeks, everything had gone wrong. First, their main brick supplier, with whom they'd worked for 5 years, suddenly and without explanation canceled their contract. Margaret personally called the plant director, yelling, threatening penalties. He mumbled something about technical issues and hung up. They had to scramble for a new supplier, losing time and money. Then a nearly signed crane rental deal collapsed. At the last moment, the rental company announced all their equipment was booked solid for 6 months. Wade, who'd been handling the negotiations, went into a rage. How could that be? Yesterday everything was set. The breaking point came with a call from City Hall. A major tender for a new residential complex, a project Margaret considered practically theirs, was suddenly canceled. Officially, due to the need for revisions to the project documentation. Margaret sat in her office surrounded by papers, unable to grasp what was happening. A streak of bad luck. Just a series of ridiculous coincidences. A curse, she muttered to Wade, who paced nervously across the room. Everything's falling apart. Someone's hexed us. She never once imagined all those coincidences traced back to one man. The very man she had always dismissed as a worthless country bumpkin. Michael never shouted, never threatened. He simply picked up the phone in the quiet of his top-floor office at Bear's Retreat and made a few calls. His network, built over decades, was invisible but strong as a spider's web. He knew everyone, factory directors, trucking company owners, city officials. He didn't need to order anyone. He simply asked, "John, hi. Remember how I helped you with that license last year? I've got a small favor to ask. Stephen, my friend, how's your son doing in college? Good, good. Listen, could you maybe hold back your equipment for a couple weeks?" He wasn't destroying their business, he was paralyzing it. Slowly, methodically, cutting off the arteries that kept the company alive. He created problems that drained their time, nerves, and most of all, their money. He knew their financial cushion wasn't nearly as big as they pretended. Meanwhile, Robert Martin wasn't only preparing the custody suit. At Michael's request, he began digging into the Harrisons' business. He spent days buried in registries, financial reports, corporate documents, searching for a weak spot, and he found one. He arrived at Michael's office late one evening with a thin folder in hand. "Michael, I found something interesting," he said, laying it on the desk. "I looked into the history of Harrison Construction. Officially, the startup capital was provided by the founders themselves, Margaret and Wade Harrison. But as we both know, they didn't have that kind of money at the time." Michael nodded silently. "I traced their financial flows from that period. No large bank loans. No official debts. The seed money, a substantial sum, hit their account in a single transfer. From where? Michael asked. Robert opened the folder. Inside was a printout from the banking registry. From a company called Horizon Investments LLC. The firm had been registered a month before Harrison Construction was founded and dissolved 6 months after the transfer. A textbook shell company. Michael stared at the name Horizon Investments. It meant nothing to him. And what does that give us? It means this, Robert said, his tone sharpening into a predator's. The transfer wasn't filed as an investment. It was a loan. 10 years, modest interest, and repayment is due in 3 months. Michael's brow furrowed. They'd taken money from a ghost company and still hadn't repaid it. Exactly. And the most interesting part, this loan was secured by a guarantor. Robert pulled out another document, a copy of the surety agreement. According to it, if Harrison Construction failed to repay the debt, the guarantor was obliged to cover the full amount with interest, with his own personal assets. He placed the document in front of Michael, and Michael saw the signature in the guarantor field. His own signature. He stared at it, and a memory surfaced. 10 years ago, Margaret had shown up at his village house. So sweet, so charming, with a basket of pies. Michael, dear. Wade and the boys want to start a small business, a little repair shop. They just need a tiny bit of seed money. We've almost got it all together, just missing a small part. Could you sign this paper for the bank? Just a formality, showing you know about it and don't mind. A guarantee for them that it's serious. He had been glad for them then. Glad that Wade was trying to do something. Of course, he signed without reading, on some form with fine print, and forgot about it 5 minutes later. But it hadn't been a harmless guarantee for the bank. It was a surety for a multi-million-dollar loan from a shell company. She had tricked him from the very start. Their entire business empire had been built on his money, money he had unknowingly guaranteed. From day one, she had set him up. This company, Horizon Investments, was liquidated. Who's the current creditor? Who do they actually owe? Robert allowed himself a slight smile. That's the most interesting part. I traced the debt. The rights to it were sold several times. For the past 5 years, they've belonged to a small private investment fund. He paused. And last week, at your instruction, I acquired that fund, along with all its assets. Which means as of today, the Harrison debt belongs to you. Michael stayed silent for a long time, staring at the papers, at Margaret's false kindness, at his own signature, at the name of the company that now held the rope around the Harrison's neck. He didn't look triumphant. His face was tired, grim. He took no joy in catching them in a trap. He mourned that they had walked into it themselves, deceiving his trust 10 years ago. All right, Robert, he said finally. Do nothing for now. Let the debt sit. Let them stew in their own mess. Let them feel the ground slipping away. For Sarah, though, the ground had already disappeared. She lived in constant tension. Days blurred into a gray nightmare of waiting for Robert's calls and fearing for Mike. She barely slept, replaying Margaret's poisonous words from the recordings in her mind. A week later, Wade called. Sarah didn't want to answer, but Linda insisted. Pick up. Put it on speaker. We need to know what they want. Sarah pressed the green button. Yes. Sarah, Wade's voice was businesslike, even irritated. You need to come pick up your stuff. Mom says your junk is taking up space in the storage room. You've got an hour. I'll leave the boxes with the concierge downstairs. If you don't take them, I'll throw them out. No hello, no how are you. Just an order. Junk. He'd called her personal belongings, the remnants of her past life, junk. Fine, she said coldly, and hung up. He's mocking you, Linda hissed. He wants to humiliate you again, make you haul those boxes in front of the whole building. I'll go, Sarah said firmly. I won't leave them anything of mine. Not a single photo, not a single book. She didn't ask Linda or her father to come. She called a moving taxi. She would go alone. This was her battle, and she had to endure the humiliation alone to grow stronger. When she arrived, 3 large boxes sat by the entrance, sloppily taped shut. The concierge, Mrs. Lopez, who always used to greet her warmly, averted her eyes and pretended to wipe the window ledge. Sarah silently walked up to the boxes. The taxi driver helped load them into the car. Back at the service apartment, she began sorting through them. The Harrisons hadn't even bothered to pack things neatly. Everything was tossed together: clothes, books, old sketch albums, makeup, trinkets. At the bottom of one box, among old sweaters, she found a document case. She opened it. Inside were birth certificates, old passports, receipts, and among them, a folded yellow slip. A receipt from Diamond Palace, the most expensive jewelry store in the city. She unfolded it. The date was 3 months ago. One item, gold locket with engraving. The sum, substantial, nearly her entire monthly salary back when she still worked. Sarah froze. A locket. She had never received a locket. She couldn't even remember the last time Wade had given her jewelry. On holidays he usually just handed her cash, buy yourself something. She turned the slip over. On the back, scribbled in pencil, apparently by the clerk under dictation, were the words, "To my V, forever. To my V, forever." Sarah sank to the floor amid the scattered things. Her mind went blank. What was this? A mistake? Maybe he'd bought it for his mother? But her name was Margaret. A relative? Victoria? Vivian? She ran through every name she knew. None fit. Her heart lurched. The first thought that seared her was betrayal. She had always pushed those thoughts away. Wade was a homebody, a bit lazy, completely dependent on his mother. He seemed to have neither the time nor the energy for affairs. She had always thought him weak, but faithful. But what if he wasn't? She sat staring at the slip. It was like a snake crawling out of a box of memories. She could have thrown it away, forgotten it. That would have been easier. But something in her had changed. The old Sarah, who preferred not to see unpleasant truths, had died in that restaurant. The new Sarah wanted to know everything, every deception, every lie. She carefully folded the receipt and slipped it into her pocket. The next day, she went to Robert. He listened, studied the receipt closely. His face, as always, revealed nothing. This could be anything, Sarah, he said evenly. A gift for his mother he didn't want to mention. A purchase to resell. A debt. Anything. Or not just anything, Sarah said softly but firmly. I want the truth. Robert studied her for a long moment. That will mean extra costs. A private investigator isn't cheap. I know, she said. She didn't mention that her own account was empty. She only said, my father will pay. Robert nodded. He picked up the phone and dialed. Igor, hi. Martin here. I've got a job. Subject, Wade Harrison. Full surveillance, movements, contacts, meetings. I want everything outside the homework store routine, especially women. The detective's name was Igor. Sarah never saw him. He was just a voice on the phone, reporting to Robert, who then relayed the information to her. The first days brought nothing. Wade lived the life of a model family man coping with a breakup. From work straight home. In the evenings, he took Mike to swimming practice. On weekends, to Margaret's country house. Robert, he's clean as a whistle, the detective reported. Either he knows he's being watched, or your client is making things up. But Sarah insisted. Keep going. Her sharpened intuition told her they were on the right track. And on the 5th day, everything changed. That Wednesday, Wade didn't go home after work. On the phone with his mother, he claimed he was stuck in an important meeting. Instead, he drove to a supermarket on the city's edge. The detective watched him wander the aisles, loading his cart. Not the usual bachelor's haul of frozen pizza and beer, but proper groceries, milk, cottage cheese, vegetables, fruit, even baby food. Then he didn't head home. He drove into a quiet residential district of new apartment blocks. He went into one building and didn't come out until late that night. The next day Robert called Sarah into his office. A brown folder lay on the desk. The detective found something, he said without preamble. He opened the folder. Inside were photographs, taken from a distance, a little blurry. There was Wade getting out of the car with grocery bags. There he was entering the building. Sarah leaned closer. The next photo showed the lit window of an apartment on the 3rd floor. 2 silhouettes visible inside, a man, clearly Wade, and a woman. Standing close. Her heart skipped a beat. Sarah stared silently at the photo. The apartment at that address, Robert continued, checking the papers, is rented under the name Barbara Stevens, 28 years old. Moved here about a year ago. No official employment. He flipped the page. The detective's report was concise, businesslike. The subject spent 3 hours in the apartment. Exited at 11:15 p.m. The lights went out half an hour later. Sarah closed her eyes. There it was. The ugly, banal truth. Another woman. Her name was Barbara. And judging by the evidence, it had been going on for some time. That's all? She asked, opening her eyes again. She had expected pain, jealousy. Instead, she felt only cold, disgusted satisfaction. Another lie exposed. Another abscess lanced. No, not all, Robert said, turning another page. The last photo in the folder had been taken the next morning. The detective had clearly staked out the building all night. The photo showed Barbara Stevens leaving the entrance, heading toward the women's clinic next door. She wore a light summer dress that couldn't hide the obvious. Robert said nothing. He simply looked at Sarah, letting her process what she saw. Barbara Stevens was pregnant. Very pregnant. At least 6 months. Expecting a child. Wade's child. Sarah stared at the photo of the pregnant Barbara. The air was gone from her lungs, as if she'd been punched. But it wasn't jealousy. It was revelation. Sharp and blinding as lightning. Now everything made sense. The haste with which they'd thrown her out. The cruelty with which they'd crushed her life. This wasn't just revenge for the restaurant humiliation. It was a cleanup operation. They needed to get rid of her, the legal wife, to make room for a new family. Her son Mike had to stay with them, to keep up appearances, to make Wade look not like a cheating scoundrel but a poor single father abandoned by his unstable wife. And somewhere on the city's edge, another woman quietly waited with another child. She lifted her eyes to Robert. "This is our trump card," he said, confirming her thoughts. "Adultery. A child on the side. Compared to this, their prenup and every accusation against you look like a farce. No court will hand custody to a father who so cynically deceived his wife." Sarah nodded slowly. She took the folder of photographs. "What are you going to do?" Robert asked. "I'm going to talk to my husband." Robert wanted to stop her, to say this was the lawyer's battle now, not her emotions. But one look at her face kept him silent. He understood, this was necessary. She needed to look him in the eye. Sarah didn't call him. She knew he'd either ignore her or lie. She drove to his office. She knew there was a staff meeting then, and he'd be there. She didn't go upstairs. She just sent a text. One word, "Barbara," and added, "I'm downstairs. You have 5 minutes." She waited in her car across the street. It wasn't 5 minutes but 3 before the office doors burst open. Wade shot out, without his jacket, just a shirt, pale, panicked. His head whipped around, searching for her. Sarah honked. He spotted the car and ran over. He slid into the passenger seat, breathing hard. How do you know?" he rasped. Sarah silently placed the folder on the dashboard. He opened it. His hands shook as he flipped through the photos. His face drained of color. When he reached the last picture of Barbara, heavily pregnant, he recoiled as if struck. "Sarah, two can explain." "Don't." Her voice was flat, hollow. "I don't need your explanations. I only need one thing." She looked him in the eye. The man she had once loved, the father of her child. Now only a pitiful, frightened traitor sat before her. "You're going straight to your mother. You both withdraw every lawsuit. You sign away custody of Mike. You give me a divorce and don't contest a thing. In return, this folder never reaches court, and no one ever learns you were building a new family behind my back." He stared at her, hope flickering in his eyes. He had expected a scene, screaming, threats. Instead he got a business deal, a chance to escape public disgrace. "All right," he nodded quickly. "Yes, of course. I'll talk to my mother. We'll fix this. Right now." He was about to get out when the car door yanked open. Margaret stood there. She must have seen him bolt from the office window and hurried after him, her face twisted with fury. "So that's it," she hissed, glaring at Sarah. "You thought you could blackmail us? Thought we'd be scared of your little papers?" She snatched the folder from Wade's hands, quickly flipped through the photos. Her face didn't change. Instead, a calculating, predatory smile spread. To Margaret, this wasn't a crisis, it was an opportunity. "Wade, get in the car," she ordered, not looking at him. Like a beaten dog, he silently climbed out of Sarah's car and trudged back toward his SUV. Margaret slid into his seat, shut the door. The car filled with the heavy scent of her expensive perfume and pure hatred. "So, he's going to have another child," she said as casually as if she were discussing buying new furniture. "Well then, children are good. They're heirs." Sarah stared at her, unable to believe her ears. "Now listen carefully, girl," Margaret went on, lowering her voice to a venomous hiss. "You thought this was your trump card? No, it's mine. Give me Barbara's address." Sarah stayed silent. "Give me the address," Margaret snapped, "or I'll find her myself, and she'll regret it." Sarah knew she wasn't bluffing. With a trembling hand, she scribbled the address from the detective's report on a napkin. Margaret snatched it, started the car, and tore off with screeching tires. Sarah, driven by instinct, followed at a distance. She had to know what this woman was planning. They ended up in that same quiet neighborhood. Margaret parked confidently by the entrance. Sarah stopped a little farther down. Minutes later, She saw Margaret emerge from the building, but not alone. Beside her, head lowered, walked Barbara. Margaret gripped her firmly by the arm and spoke to her. They got into Margaret's SUV and drove toward the city center. They stopped at a small but cozy cafe. Through the large window, Sarah saw them sit at a corner table. Barbara sat hunched, frightened. She didn't know who this domineering woman was, but she understood. Her future and her baby's future depended on her. Wade had been nervous lately, muttering about problems and money running out. She feared being left alone, without support. Margaret ordered them tea and began to speak. "So, Barbara," her tone was patronizing but hard, "the situation has changed. I know about your pregnancy. Wade may be a fool, but what's done is done. We won't abandon a child. That's Harrison blood." Barbara lifted tear-filled eyes, shining with hope. You'll help us?" "We'll help," Margaret nodded. "In fact, we'll make sure you and the baby have everything you need. You'll get a new, spacious apartment. Not this hole on the outskirts, but in a good neighborhood. You'll have monthly support, enough so you don't need to work until the child starts school. A car. Anything you want." Barbara gasped. It was more than she had ever dared dream. All her fears, all her problems, solved in an instant. What do I have to do?" she whispered. "Something simple," Margaret smirked. "Just help us solve one little problem. Wade's ex-wife. She turned out to be a nasty, quarrelsome woman. She's trying to take my grandson, our Mike. All you need to do is come to court and testify." "What kind of testimony?" Barbara asked, bewildered. "The truth, of course," Margaret's voice turned steely. "You'll tell them how Sarah stalked Wade, how she threatened him, how she called you, insulted you, swore she'd ruin your life and your unborn child's, how Wade came to you with bruises after her beatings, how he confided he was afraid of her, that she was uncontrollable in her rage." Barbara stared at Margaret, her hope turning to horror. "But that never happened," she stammered. "I've never even met her. And Wade, he never—" "Details," Margaret cut her off. "You just need to say it. For your child's sake. Think of him. Do you want him to grow up in poverty? Or do you want him to have the best of everything? The choice is yours. Either you're with us, and you'll have everything. Or you're against us, and you'll have nothing. And believe me, I know how to make sure people have nothing." Barbara lowered her head. She was trapped. On one side, lies, betrayal, crime. On the other, a secure future for her baby. She felt crushed. She feared this woman. Her steely gaze, her confidence. She knew Margaret wasn't bluffing. "I agree," she whispered faintly. "Good girl," Margaret nodded with satisfaction. She launched into detailed instructions about exactly what Barbara would have to say in court. She was in her element, reveling in her cunning and power over this terrified girl. And Barbara, listening, did something that changed everything. She sat with her hands on her swollen belly. Her phone lay on her lap, hidden under the table. As Wade's mother mapped out her perjury script, Barbara quietly slid her thumb across the screen and tapped the recorder icon. A red circle lit up silently. She didn't know why she did it. It was desperation. Instinct. She recorded it all. Every word from Margaret. Every detail of her monstrous plan to bribe a witness and fabricate testimony. She was creating her own insurance. Her own leverage against the woman trying to buy her soul. Across the street in her car, Sarah saw it all. She saw Margaret talking, gesturing, Barbara sitting with her head down. She couldn't hear, but she knew. Margaret wasn't negotiating, she was recruiting, turning Sarah's trump card into a weapon against her. When they came out, Margaret's face gleamed with triumph. She patted Barbara's shoulder like she owned her, put her in a taxi, then climbed into her SUV and drove away. Victorious. Sarah waited until Barbara's taxi disappeared around the corner. She didn't follow. What was the point? It was clear. The Harrisons were one step ahead again. Now they had not only the prenup but also the image of a victim of her abuse. A pregnant victim. It sounded like a sentence. She returned to Robert's office, crushed. She told him everything she had seen. "They bought her," she finished, her voice flat. "She'll testify against me." Robert frowned. "Witness tampering is a crime. But we can't prove it. We don't have a recording of their conversation." "What do we do now?" Sarah asked. "The same as before," he replied, his voice steely again. "We work. We prepare for trial. Their case looks strong, but it's built on lies. And every lie eventually cracks. Our job is to find that crack and strike it." The next weeks were hell. The court scheduled the main custody hearing. The Harrisons, sensing their advantage, attacked. Their lawyer buried the court in motions. They demanded Sarah undergo psychological and psychiatric evaluations, citing her unstable behavior and obsession with painting. They submitted those very photos of her so-called den. Robert fought them off, but it drained time and strength. And worst of all, during all this, Sarah wasn't allowed to see Mike. She was granted only 2 short phone calls a week. And those calls were torture. Mike answered in single words. His voice was tense, distant. She could feel Margaret standing right beside him. Sarah tried to tell him how much she loved him, how much she missed him. All she heard in return was a flat "uh-huh" or "okay." After each call, Sarah sat staring at the wall, her heart tearing apart with helplessness. Margaret's poison was working. And then the day of the trial came. Sarah walked into the courtroom like onto a scaffold. Heavy, suffocating atmosphere. High ceilings, wood-paneled walls. Opposite her sat Margaret and Wade. Margaret looked at her with open contempt. Wade, as always, avoided her eyes. Their lawyer was spreading thick folders of documents across the table. Sarah sat beside Robert. Linda sat in the front row of the gallery. She had taken a day off work to support her cousin. A tablet was in her hands, connected to mobile internet. "I'll check every word they say in real time," she had told Sarah that morning. The session began. The Harrisons' lawyer spoke at length, pompously painting a picture of an ideal family destroyed by a selfish, mentally unstable mother. He spoke of her bohemian habits, her neglect of maternal duty. Then he called witnesses. Neighbor Mrs. Wilson, eyes downcast, mumbled about rarely seeing Sarah outside with her son, about the constant smell of paint from the apartment. Mike's teacher said that lately the boy had become withdrawn and anxious. It was unpleasant, but not fatal. Robert cross-examined them, and their testimonies began to crumble. Mrs. Wilson admitted she only saw Sarah in the evenings because she herself was at work during the day. The teacher couldn't say for sure when exactly Mike's behavior had changed. But then the Harrisons' lawyer announced, "Your Honor, the plaintiff calls an expert witness. We have invited a leading child psychologist, Dr. Archibald Williams, who has conducted several sessions with the minor Michael Harrison and is ready to present his findings on the child's psychological state." A man of about 60 entered the courtroom, solid, with a well-groomed gray beard and glasses in an expensive frame. He radiated confidence and authority. He took the witness chair, swore in, and began to speak. And it was a nightmare. He spoke calmly, confidently, sprinkling in clinical terms. He claimed the boy was in a state of severe post-traumatic stress, that his trauma was caused by his mother's behavior, her emotional coldness and unpredictable outbursts of anger, which the child had supposedly described to him with tears in his eyes. "The boy does not see his mother as a source of safety, but as a threat," Williams declared, looking directly at the judge, an older woman with a weary face. "He exhibits what is known as victim Stockholm syndrome, trying to justify her behavior while subconsciously fearing her. Any further contact with his mother at this stage would be extremely damaging. It could inflict irreversible harm on his developing psyche. What the child needs is peace, stability, and a predictable environment, which he receives from his father and loving grandmother." Sarah listened, an icy band tightening around her chest. It was pure lies. He was repeating Margaret's words, just dressed up in scientific jargon. He wasn't describing her, he was describing a monster. And the worst part, the judge was listening very closely. She took notes in her pad. This so-called expert's words were clearly making an impression. Robert tried to object, to cross-examine. "Doctor, on how many sessions did you base these conclusions?" "For full sessions, 90 minutes each," Williams answered smoothly, without blinking. "Do you have video recordings of these sessions?" "I never record conversations with children. That would break the trust," he explained with a paternal smile. He was untouchable. Every question he deflected easily, hiding behind professional ethics and the child's best interest. Sarah's case was crumbling before her eyes. With a single testimony, this expert was undoing all their work. Sarah cast a desperate look at Linda. Linda sat glued to her tablet, her fingers flying furiously over the screen. Her face was pale but focused. She was searching for something. And then Sarah saw her freeze. Linda zoomed in on something on the screen, studying it closely. Then her eyes widened. She started typing quickly, opening tab after tab. A strange look spread over her face, a mix of shock and predatory excitement. She lifted her eyes to Sarah and gave the slightest nod. Then she typed a message and sent it to Robert. Robert's phone, lying on the table, vibrated silently. He had just finished his futile cross-examination and was sitting down. He glanced at the screen. Williams was already finishing his speech. Therefore, Your Honor, as a specialist with 30 years of experience, I strongly recommend excluding all contact between the child and the mother for the next 6 months and assigning him intensive psychotherapy to overcome the psychological trauma. The judge nodded sympathetically. It was over. And at that very moment, Robert stood. Your Honor, pardon me. I have one more question for the expert. Just one. The judge frowned but allowed it. Dr. Williams, Robert said, locking eyes with the psychologist. You mentioned having 30 years of experience. Impressive. Could you clarify where exactly you were practicing, say, 5 years ago? It was an odd question. Williams hesitated for a moment. I worked in several private clinics, ran my own practice, and in the public health system? For instance, at the city psychiatric dispensary? Irritation flickered across Williams's face. Yes, I worked there many years ago. What does that have to do with anything? Directly, Robert said, lifting his phone and turning the screen toward the judge. Your Honor, I asked the court to admit information obtained just now from public sources, specifically from the Department of Health website and the Judicial Archive. He read slowly, deliberately. According to Order No. 347 HS, 5 years ago, psychiatrist Archibald Williams was dismissed from the city psychiatric dispensary for repeated gross violations, and by ruling of the district court on that same date, his license to practice medicine was revoked. The courtroom fell into dead silence. The grounds, Robert went on, his voice booming in the stillness, were falsification of medical records and expert reports, as well as receiving payments for knowingly false testimony in parental rights cases. Mr. Williams, Robert turned back to the expert, who now sat pale as a sheet, gripping the armrests of his chair. You are no doctor. You are a repeat perjurer, and you've just committed another felony under oath. Williams shrank into the chair. His air of authority and respectability had evaporated. What remained was a small, sweaty, terrified old man. He opened and closed his mouth like a fish stranded on the shore, but no sound came out. The judge looked from him to Robert to her clerk, who was already frantically typing, checking the information. The judge's face shifted from sympathetic to ice-cold. Bailiff, she said sharply, escort Mr. Williams to a separate room until this is clarified, and call in the police. Margaret shot to her feet. Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding. A provocation. We didn't know. Sit down, Mrs. Harrison, the judge cut her off. The court will determine who knew what. This hearing is adjourned. The next session will be scheduled after the prosecutor's office investigates perjury and fraud. It was a rout, total and absolute. When Sarah walked out of the courtroom, she saw 2 officers leading Williams away. She met Margaret's eyes. The contempt was gone. Now there was only pure, concentrated hatred and fear. For the first time, Sarah saw fear in her eyes. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. That evening, Robert's office buzzed with cautious triumph. Linda was the hero of the day. How did you recognize him? Sarah asked. His face looked familiar, Linda shrugged. About 7 years ago, a friend of mine was going through a divorce, and her husband tried to take the kids. He dragged this same creep into court. Same stories about traumatized children. Back then, they believed him. I just searched his name with termination of parental rights, and up popped that old court order. They didn't even bother to check who they were dealing with. Their arrogance will be their downfall. This is a serious blow to their credibility, Robert said, flipping through papers. But it doesn't guarantee us victory in custody. They'll claim they were duped, that they're victims of a fraud. We need the next move. A strike they can't recover from. Just then Michael walked into the office. He hadn't been in court, but he already knew everything. He silently shook Linda's hand, gratitude written in the gesture more than in words. Well done, he said. Then he looked at Sarah and Robert. Now we need to finish this war. They built their attack on lies and greed. So we'll strike at that same weakness, their greed. The plan was born right there in Robert's office. Risky, bold, devilishly clever. Like a chess match, where the bait was a piece that didn't even exist. The next day Margaret sat in her lawyer's office. He was grim, pacing the floor. This is a disaster, he muttered. Bringing in a fraudulent expert stains our entire case. The judge will scrutinize every word we say from now on. What do? We need to prove Sarah is unfit to care for the child, not just morally, but financially. That she's irresponsible, can't manage property. That only Wade can provide stability for the boy. Just then, the secretary entered. Excuse me, a notary from the regional center is on the line. Says it's urgent, something about Sarah Harrison's inheritance. A Mr. Peter Voronov. Margaret and her lawyer exchanged glances. What inheritance? The lawyer switched on speakerphone. Go ahead, Mr. Voronov. Good afternoon, came a deep, solid baritone. I'm handling the estate of the late Anna Stepanovna Michailova. She was, if I'm not mistaken, the grandmother of your client. That's correct, the lawyer confirmed. The thing is, the lady wasn't so simple after all. She left her granddaughter a parcel of land, 50 acres, in the village of Red Meadows. Margaret scoffed. A patch of dirt and some backwater. So what? So what, the notary continued, is that this village falls into the zone of a new federal highway and logistics hub project. That land is about to turn into gold. Preliminary estimates show its value will rise tenfold, maybe 100. We're talking millions of dollars. The room fell silent. I'm calling, the notary went on, because Sarah has yet to claim the inheritance. The deadline expires in 2 weeks. If she doesn't, the land reverts to the state. Given your custody battle, I felt obliged to inform the other side. This may be relevant to determining the mother's financial standing. He said goodbye and hung up. Margaret stared at her lawyer, her eyes blazing. Millions. Dollars. For that pauper. From her village kin. Impossible. Unfair. That money belonged to their family. To their grandson. Which meant, to them. We must get that land, she whispered. How? The lawyer spread his hands. It's her inheritance. What if she already gifted it? A wild gleam lit Margaret's eyes. What if she gave it to Wade? Long ago. When things were still good between them. As a sign of love and devotion. They just never formalized it. The lawyer looked at her in horror. You're suggesting forging a deed of gift? Backdated? I'm suggesting restoring justice, Margaret snapped. That little tramp can't get a dime. Find someone. The best. No flaws. The paper, the ink, the signature, everything perfect. We'll produce a gift deed dated last year. And file it in court immediately. Proof that she gave up that property to her husband, which means she can't be considered financially responsible. They had no idea the notary Voronov was an actor from a local theater, hired by Michael for one phone call. They had no idea no such grandmother's land existed. The village of Red Meadows was real, but the parcel was pure invention. They had swallowed the bait whole. 3 days later, the court received a new motion from the Harrisons. Attached was a perfectly prepared document, a deed of gift for the land parcel. Old, slightly yellowed paper. The right kind of ink. And the signature. Sarah's signature was forged to perfection. The deed stated that she, Sarah Harrison, freely gifted her beloved husband, Wade Harrison, the parcel of land allegedly passed to her by verbal agreement from her grandmother. That same day Robert and Michael sat in the office, staring at a copy of the deed. They did it, Robert said, his voice a mix of admiration for the brazenness of the enemy and the satisfaction of a predator who had cornered his prey. They just filed a forged document in court on a non-existent asset. This is large-scale fraud, Robert concluded. A criminal case. Real prison time. But when Robert called Sarah and told her everything, she felt no joy. Only bitterness. They were willing to do anything, any betrayal, any crime, just to destroy her and take what they thought rightfully belonged to them. What now? She asked. Now we wait, Robert replied. Wait for them to read this motion aloud in open court, and then. He paused. And then we'll present the official response from the land registry, stating that no parcel of land with such a cadastral number in the name of the late Anna Stepanovna Michailova has ever existed. They didn't just forge your signature. They forged the entire document, claiming an asset that doesn't exist. That's not just fraud, it's a farce. And they'll pay dearly for it. The waiting was torture. Sarah knew the trap had snapped shut, but the Harrisons didn't realize it yet. They carried on as if victory was theirs, while in Robert's safe sat the document that would blow their world apart. Meanwhile, Michael decided it was time to deliver the final crushing blow. He no longer wanted to play the long game, slowly choking their business, exposing the fake psychologist and, most of all, Margaret's readiness to commit forgery over non-existent land had drained his patience. He saw now that these people would stop at nothing, which meant they had to be not just punished, but destroyed. He called Robert. Robert, prepare the Horizon Investments documents. The loan isn't due yet, but there should be a clause for early recall. There is, Robert replied immediately. Clause 7. 4. The lender may demand full early repayment of the loan and all accrued interest if fraudulent actions by the borrower are uncovered that harm the guarantor's business reputation or financial stability. Their forged deed in court is exactly that. They didn't just compromise themselves, they compromised you as guarantor. Perfect, Michael's voice was granite. But I don't just want the money. They don't have it anyway. I want the collateral. What's in it? All their major construction equipment, Robert said. 2 tower cranes, 3 dump trucks, a bulldozer, an excavator. Everything their business depends on. Start the procedure, Michael ordered. And I don't want it to be just a legal action. I want it to be a show. The next morning, uninvited guests arrived at Harrison Construction's flagship site, where they were just starting an upscale residential complex. A convoy of massive haulers with low-bed trailers rolled in. At the front, a black SUV stopped, and out stepped Robert Martin with several burly men in work uniforms, marked with the logo of an unknown transport company. The site manager ran out of his trailer. "Who the hell are you? What's going on here?" Robert silently handed him a court-issued writ stamped with the seal. "Under the terms of the collateral agreement, we are seizing property that belongs to us. Here's the list." The foreman stared at the paper, then at the trucks, not understanding. He started making frantic calls. 15 minutes later, Wade's SUV screeched onto the site. He jumped out, his face twisted with rage and confusion. "What the hell is going on here? Martin, what the hell do you think you're doing?" "I'm only carrying out my client's wishes," Robert replied calmly. "Your company breached the loan agreement. We're seizing our collateral." "What loan? What client?" Wade yelled. "The client is the investment fund you've owed a large sum to for 10 years, Robert explained. "As for the loan, maybe you should ask your mother. She knows all the details." By then, workers were already preparing the first tower crane for loading. They worked fast and efficiently. This wasn't just a repossession, it was a public flogging. The news spread through the city instantly. Everyone heard that Harrison Construction's equipment was being hauled away. Not seized by the tax office, seized by creditors. Taken physically, in broad daylight, before the entire city. It meant one thing: the company wasn't just in trouble, it was bankrupt. Margaret rushed to the site just as the first crane was being dismantled and laid in pieces onto a trailer. She saw Robert and instantly understood. She knew whose blow this was. Not the banks. Not competitors. It came from the one person she'd never expected. The village nobody. "It's him," she hissed at Wade. "Your father-in-law did this." By evening, the site was empty. Where bustling work had been that morning, there were now only gaping pits and scattered debris. The Harrison Empire, built on lies and deceit, had collapsed in a single day. It wasn't just bankrupt on paper, it had been dismantled, piece by piece, and carted away on trucks. But it wasn't over yet. The next day, as Margaret and Wade sat in their office, trying to grasp the scale of the disaster and dialing lawyers, a courier arrived. He delivered 2 envelopes, one addressed to Wade, the other to Margaret. Inside were not new lawsuits. Inside were official eviction notices. Margaret stared at the paper in disbelief. Eviction? Them? From their own apartment? That luxurious downtown condo she had flaunted, the symbol of their success? "This is a mistake," she whispered. "This apartment is ours. We bought it." Wade took the document from her hands, read it, and his face went ashen. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "The apartment, it's not ours." Margaret gaped at him. "What do you mean, not ours?" "It's not registered to us. It's registered to Harrison Construction, as a company asset. You told me to do it that way, for tax optimization." And it hit Margaret. She remembered. Yes, it had been her idea. To avoid property tax. To write off the renovation and utility bills through the company. It had seemed so clever, so smart. And now that clever decision had turned into a trap. They sat in the empty office of their ruined company, slowly grasping the full depth of their fall. They no longer had a business. They no longer had money. And now, they no longer even had a home. The notice stated that the apartment, like all other assets of the bankrupt company, was being transferred to the main creditor to cover the debt. The creditor's name was printed at the bottom of the document, the investment fund owned by Michael Mikhailoff. He had taken everything from them. Their business, their future, their home. Margaret sat staring into space. Her whole life, everything she had lied, schemed, and betrayed for, had crumbled to dust. She had lost. But in her head there still flickered one last, desperate thought. The one thing they hadn't yet taken from her. Mike, her grandson. He was still with them. And as long as he was with them, she still had leverage. She still had hope. Margaret sat in the silence of her former office, her mind ravaged by catastrophe, as a new, desperate plan began to form. They had lost everything: business, money, home. All that was left was Mike. And she realized he wasn't just leverage. He was their only asset, their ticket out. She lifted her head and looked at Wade. He sat with his head in his hands, completely broken. A weakling. Useless. He had always been that way. She realized she would have to act alone. "Wade," she said, her voice suddenly calm. "Enough wallowing. We need to act." He looked up at her with empty eyes. "Act? Do what, Mom?" "It's over. We're bankrupt. We're being evicted. And the trial after the Williams fiasco and that forged deed, we're looking at criminal charges. Which is exactly why we won't wait for trial." She cut him off. "I'll take Mike and go to my sister's cottage for a few days. Away from all this chaos. The boy needs fresh air. He needs to calm down. In the meantime, you figure out our things. Find us somewhere temporary to live." Wade looked at her with relief. His mother's plan, as always, sounded logical. Send Mike away from the problems. Yes, it was a good idea. Yes, Mom, of course. Go. Rest. He never suspected a thing. He was too sunk in his own grief to notice the steely glint in his mother's eyes. Margaret went back home. Their former home. They had 3 days to move out. She stepped into the apartment that just yesterday had seemed like a fortress and today was nothing but a collection of expensive, but already foreign, things. She didn't bother with the crystal or paintings. She went straight to Mike's room. The boy was sitting on the floor, building something with his blocks. When he saw his grandmother, he didn't brighten. Lately, he had become quiet, withdrawn. "Mike, pack up," Margaret said with that false sweetness in her voice she played so well. "We're going on a little trip. To a very beautiful place, where it's warm and there's the sea." Mike's eyes lit up for a second. "And Mom? Is Mom coming with us?" he asked hopefully. The smile slid off Margaret's face. "No, Mike, Mom isn't coming. She doesn't want to. She doesn't love us anymore. I told you that." The hope in the boy's eyes died. He lowered his head again. Margaret quickly and briskly began packing his things into a small suitcase. T-shirts, shorts, sandals, his favorite stuffed bear. Then she went to her bedroom. From a hiding spot behind a painting, she pulled out stacks of cash, everything she had siphoned from the company over the past months. Her personal black fund. She packed the money and her jewelry into a travel bag. She wasn't going to her sister's cottage. An hour earlier, she had sat in a small travel agency on the edge of town. "I need 2 one-way tickets on the next available flight," she told the young agent. "Where to?" "Somewhere warm, where no visas required," Margaret replied. "And where there's no extradition." The girl looked at her in surprise but didn't argue. The customer is always right. 10 minutes later, Margaret had 2 tickets in her email for a morning flight to a Latin American country. After packing, she realized there was still one last loose end. One thread that had to be cut. Barbara, Wade's pregnant mistress. She wasn't just unnecessary now, she was dangerous. She was a witness. A witness to how Margaret had tried to stage perjury. If Barbara talked, it would mean another criminal charge. Margaret dialed her number. "Barbara? It's Margaret. We need to meet. Urgently." They met at the same cafe. Barbara arrived nervous. She had heard about Harrison Construction's collapse. All her dreams of a new apartment and a secure life were crumbling before her eyes. "Margaret, what happened? What about our deal?" Margaret looked at her with cold, empty eyes. "Forget it," she snapped. "There is no deal anymore." "What do you mean?" Barbara stammered. "But you promised for my baby." "Circumstances changed," Margaret cut her off. "There's no money. And no apartment. You're on your own." Barbara stared at her, tears welling up. She had been used, and now she was being thrown away like garbage. "But I could go to court." "And say what?" Margaret sneered. "That you agreed to lie under oath for money? You'd be the first one they locked up for attempted fraud." She leaned across the table, her voice dropping low and menacing. "Now listen to me, girl. You disappear. You leave this city and never come back. You forget Wade Harrison's name. You forget my name. You forget you ever knew us." "But my baby," Barbara sobbed. "And if you don't forget," Margaret went on, ignoring her, "I can't guarantee the safety of you or your unborn child. Accidents happen, especially to lonely pregnant women in their final months. Do you understand me?" Barbara stared into her icy eyes and understood. This wasn't just a threat. It was a death sentence. This woman was capable of anything. She hadn't just lost her hope for a better life. Now she feared for her own. Margaret stood, tossed a few bills on the table for tea, and walked out without a goodbye. She was satisfied. The last thread had been cut. and in that instant, her world collapsed. She had been betrayed, threatened. Her life and the life of her unborn child were under threat. She was just a pawn, cast aside. Something inside her flipped. The guilt that had tormented her gave way to something stronger, fear. And fear gave birth to rage, the rage of a cornered animal with nothing left to lose. She realized that silence meant waiting for Margaret to carry out her threat. Her only chance of survival was to act. Now, with trembling hands, she pulled out her phone. She didn't call the police. Who would they believe? Her, the unemployed mistress, or the powerful, though bankrupt, businesswoman? She scrolled to the one number she had saved just in case, back when Sarah's detective had first tracked her down. She had traced the car and found the owner through friends. She hadn't known why she did it, just in case. Now that case had arrived. She found the name Sarah Harrison and pressed call. Sarah was in her temporary apartment when the phone rang. Unknown number. She almost declined, but something made her pick up. Yes. Sarah? A shaky female voice. You don't know me. My name is Barbara. Sarah froze. Barbara? That Barbara. What do you want? She asked coldly. I have to tell you something. Barbara's voice cracked. Your mother-in-law, Margaret. She threatened me and my baby. So what? Sarah replied indifferently. That's between you and her. No. Barbara almost screamed. It's your business too. She's running. She's taking your son and leaving the country. Tonight. She has tickets for the morning flight. Sarah shot to her feet. How do you know? She told me herself she was leaving. And I am afraid she'll do something to Mike if anyone tries to stop her. She's desperate. She's capable of anything. Sarah listened, her blood running cold. Running. Taking Mike. It was the final, most terrifying blow. The one she never saw coming. Where? Which flight? Which airport? I don't know, Barbara sobbed. But she's leaving tonight. Please, stop her. Save your son. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her. She grabbed her keys, her purse, and ran for the door. The first call she made was to her father. Dad, Margaret's taking Mike. She's fleeing the country. What? Where's this coming from? Michael's voice cracked like a whip. It doesn't matter. It's real. She's heading for the airport. Morning flight. I understand, Michael said without hesitation. Which airport? I don't know. Sarah cried in despair, already sprinting down the street. We only have one international airport. I'm on my way. Robert will contact airport security. Go there. Don't lose her. Sarah tore through the night city, ignoring traffic lights, traffic, everything. The world had shrunk to one goal, catch her. In time. Images flashed through her mind like knives, a plane lifting into the sky, carrying her son away forever. Her hands gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't pray. She commanded God, the universe, herself. Just let her make it. She screeched into the airport parking lot, abandoned the car, and ran inside. The cavernous hall, the departure board. She frantically scanned the flights. Istanbul, Dubai, Antalya. Any of these could be the gateway. And then she saw them. They were in line for check-in on a flight to a visa-free Latin American country. Departure in an hour. Margaret, in dark glasses despite the night, and a ridiculous travel coat. Beside her, little Mike, clutching his teddy bear, eyes downcast. Margaret held a small suitcase and his backpack. Sarah froze. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt to breathe. There he was. Her son. Just a few feet away. She hadn't seen him in weeks. He looked older, more serious. She wanted to run to him, scream. But her father's voice echoed in her head, don't lose her. She forced herself to breathe deeply. No panic. No mistakes. Wait for her father. She hid behind a column, watching. The line inched forward. Margaret kept looking around, tense, on edge. She said something to Mike, but he didn't answer, just hugged his bear tighter. They reached the counter. Margaret handed over the passports. The clerk typed into the computer. And then Sarah saw two uniformed security men approach. They spoke quietly to Margaret. She started protesting, waving her arms. That was the signal. It was time. Sarah stepped out from behind the column. At that same moment, her father entered the hall, Robert and several strong men in plain clothes at his side. They saw each other across the hall. Michael nodded. Sarah moved forward, not running, walking, slowly, deliberately, cutting through the crowd. Her eyes locked on her son. Mike, she called. Her voice rang loud and clear through the cavernous hall. The boy flinched. He raised his head and saw her. His eyes widened in astonishment. He froze, unable to believe. "Mom," he whispered. Margaret spun around. When she saw Sarah, and behind her, Michael and Robert, she knew it was over. The trap had sprung. But Margaret wasn't one to surrender. Cornered, she was more dangerous than ever. "What are you doing here?" she shrieked at Sarah, her voice breaking into a screech. "I forbid you to come near this child. He's afraid of you." She seized Mike's hand, gripped it so hard the boy cried out in pain. "We're leaving," Margaret screamed, trying to drag him toward the security checkpoint. "You abandoned him, and now you want to take him back? I won't allow it. He's mine." A crowd began to gather. People pulled out their phones and started recording. A public scene, the very thing Margaret had always feared, was now working against her. "Come on, Mike," she pulled at him. "Your mother is bad. She wants to hurt you." And at that moment, Mike looked at his grandmother. He didn't listen to her words, he looked at her face. And for the first time in his life, he saw her true self. Not the loving, caring grandma. He saw a face twisted with malice, distorted with hatred. The face of a stranger, a frightening woman. He saw her crazed eyes. He felt the pain in his wrist, twisted in her iron grip. All the poisonous words she had whispered to him for months, all the lies about a bad mother who chose paintings over him, crumbled into dust in a single second. He saw the truth. Raw, naked, terrifying. He saw who the real monster was. And he made his choice. With a cry full not of fear but of rage, he tore his hand free from her grip. "Let go. You're lying to me." He screamed so loudly it echoed through the entire airport. "Mom is good. You're the evil one." He shoved her away and started to run. Through the crowd, knocking into people, stumbling over suitcases. He ran without looking back. He ran toward the only source of safety and love he knew. He ran straight into Sarah's legs, clutching them with all his strength. "Mommy," he cried, his little body shaking with sobs. "Mommy, don't give me to her. I want to stay with you. I love you." Sarah dropped to her knees on the dirty airport floor. She wrapped her arms around her son, pressed him to her chest. She breathed in the scent of his hair, kissed the top of his head, and cried. Silent tears, tears of exhaustion. Months of pain, despair, and struggle ended in that moment, in that embrace, in those words. He had chosen her. He had broken through the web of lies. He had come back. Her boy had come home. Sarah knelt in the middle of the departure hall, holding her sobbing son. She saw and heard nothing but the beat of his small heart and his desperate whispers, "Mommy, don't give me away." She stroked his head, his back, rocking him like a baby, feeling the tension of the past weeks finally begin to leave her body. Everything else ceased to exist. But the world around them didn't stand still. The scene at the airport caused a sensation. Dozens of phones recording Margaret's hysteria and Mike's flight to his mother did their work. By evening, videos had spread across every city channel and news site. Scandal at the airport. Grandmother tried to kidnap her grandson. Dramatic family conflict. Child ran from grandmother into mother's arms. Margaret Harrison's reputation, already tarnished by the false psychologist, was destroyed. Completely and irreversibly. Now she wasn't just a troublemaker. She was a wicked witch who tormented her own grandson. A public disgrace she would never recover from. As for Margaret herself, after Mike tore free, she froze. She stood in the middle of the crowd, humiliated, watching as her last trump card, her last hope, embraced her enemy. Airport security and the police, arriving in time, politely but firmly escorted her to a private room for questioning. Attempted illegal removal of a child abroad, especially with an ongoing custody dispute, was a serious offense. Michael and Robert handled everything. They spoke to the police, signed statements. Sarah, meanwhile, was in the mother and child room. She washed Mike's face, gave him water. He clung to her hand, as if afraid she might vanish again. He stumbled over his words, crying as he told her how his grandmother had said Mommy was bad, that she had abandoned him, how she forced him to stay silent during phone calls. Sarah listened, her heart breaking for her son, while rage at the woman who had done this burned inside her. They didn't go back to the temporary apartment. Michael brought them to his house. A huge, quiet home outside the city, one Sarah hadn't even known existed. "From now on, you'll live here," he said simply. "No one will touch you here." The next day passed in a haze. Mike never left Sarah's side. They ate breakfast together, walked in the large garden, read books. Sarah felt her boy slowly thaw, his childhood innocence beginning to return. That evening, when she tucked him into bed, he suddenly asked, "Mom, is Dad bad too?" Sarah hesitated. She didn't want to lie, but she also didn't want to turn him against his father. "Dad's just confused, sweetheart," she said carefully. "He loves his mom very much, sometimes so much that he makes mistakes." She knew it was a weak answer, but it was all she had. Later that day, Robert called. "Sarah, could you come to my office? We need to talk." When Sarah entered, she saw he wasn't alone. Sitting in the visitor's chair was Barbara. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying. When she saw Sarah, she jumped up, then sank back down, unsure of what to do. Sarah stopped in the doorway. She didn't know what to feel toward this woman. Anger? Pity? Contempt? "Hello," Barbara said softly. "Please, sit down, Sarah," Robert said. "Barbara asked to meet with us. She wants to help." Sarah sat, keeping her distance. She waited in silence. Barbara drew a shaky breath. "I know you probably hate me," she began, staring at the floor. "And you have every right. I did awful things. I believed Wade. I believed his mother. I was blind and foolish." She lifted her tear-filled eyes to Sarah. "But when she threatened my child, I realized who I was dealing with. I don't want anything to do with these people. I want them to pay for what they did to you and for what they tried to do to me." She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I recorded our last conversation at the cafe, when she offered me money for false testimony, and when she threatened me afterward." She handed the phone to Robert. "It's all here." Robert took the phone. Not a muscle moved on his face. He plugged in the earbuds so the recording wouldn't play aloud in the office. Sarah watched as he pressed play. He listened in silence, his face hardening by the second. Sarah and Barbara sat completely still, the only sound in the room the low hum of the computer. A minute passed. 2, 5. The recording was long. Sarah saw the muscles tighten in Robert's jaw. He was listening to proof of bribery and blackmail. More than enough to bury Margaret in court. Then Robert frowned. He hit pause, rewound slightly, and replayed a section. He did it again. And again. Sarah couldn't hold back. "What is it?" she asked. Robert pulled out the earbuds. He looked at Sarah with a heavy, unblinking stare. "Bribery and threats are serious," he said slowly. "That alone is another criminal case for Margaret. But at the end of the recording, there's something even more interesting." He rewound to the very end. This time he played it through the speaker. First came Margaret's venomous voice, the moment she threatened Barbara. "I can't guarantee the safety of you or your baby." Then Barbara is sobbing, "Why are you doing this to me?" And then, words Margaret tossed over her shoulder as she left. Words dripping with arrogance and contempt for everyone else's stupidity. A final jab to crush Barbara, to show just how much smarter she was than the rest of the world. "You think you're the only fool?" she hissed. "I made that spineless husband of hers trick her into signing a prenup disguised as mortgage paperwork. And the signature on it? Ha! I forged it myself. Took her old documents and traced it through glass. Perfect match. She still thinks she signed it herself. And no one will ever prove otherwise." The office went dead silent. Sarah listened, her vision darkening. She remembered that day, the fever, the weakness. Wade shuffling papers. And Margaret, handing her tea with a smile. It was her, not Wade. She was behind everything. She had forged the signature. Robert switched off the recording. He looked at Sarah. She just confessed to forging documents and collusion. She destroyed her strongest weapon. That prenup, the foundation of their entire defense, isn't just unfair, it's a fake. And now we have her own confession to prove it. This is the end. Final and absolute. Sarah left Robert's office on unsteady legs. That arrogance, that smug contempt for the world, it had finally destroyed her. The final hearing wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. Not a clash of arguments, but the reading of a sentence. The Harrisons sat at their table, deflated, gray, broken. Margaret, released under house arrest after the airport incident, stared into space. Wade sat beside her, head sunk deep into his shoulders. Their high-priced lawyer looked like he wished he were anywhere else. He knew there was nothing left to defend. Robert Martin was brilliant. He didn't gloat. He worked like a surgeon, methodical, precise, cutting out a malignant tumor. No shouting, no theatrics. Just facts, laid before the judge one by one. Each fact was another nail in the Harrisons' coffin. "Your Honor," he began in an even voice, "throughout these proceedings the plaintiffs have repeatedly tried to mislead the court. Let's review them in order." And he did. First, a disc with the testimony of the fake psychologist Williams, along with the prosecutor's findings confirming he was under criminal investigation for fraud and perjury. Then came the forged deed of gift for the non-existent land parcel. Robert read the official land registry's response confirming that no such property existed. He noted, in passing, that those materials had already been referred to investigators for yet another fraud case. Next, he submitted testimony from airport security staff and surveillance footage showing Margaret Harrison attempting to illegally take a minor child abroad in violation of a court order. And finally, the piece de resistance, the audio recording. Your Honor, we have here an audio recording of a conversation between Margaret Harrison and witness Barbara Stevens. On this tape, Margaret Harrison offers financial rewards and material benefits in exchange for knowingly false testimony against my client. That is bribery. She then threatens the witness and her unborn child with violence. That is extortion. And most importantly, at the end of the conversation, boasting about her impunity, she directly admits that she forged my client's signature on the prenuptial agreement that underpins this entire case. Robert pressed play on his laptop. Margaret's smug voice filled the courtroom. I forged it myself. Traced it through glass. Margaret leapt to her feet. Lies. This is doctored. A setup. She shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. The judge slammed her gavel. Silence. Sit down, Mrs. Harrison, or I will have you removed. Margaret collapsed back onto the bench. It was over. The court delivered its ruling the same day. Short, crushing. The prenuptial agreement was declared null and void, signed under deception and with a forged signature. Custody of Michael Harrison was awarded to his mother, Sarah Harrison. Wade Harrison was ordered to pay child support in the legally established amount. All claims and motions from the Harrison side were dismissed. And finally, the court ordered all case materials on perjury, the land fraud, bribery and extortion, document forgery, and the attempted child abduction forwarded to the district attorney for criminal prosecution of Margaret Harrison and her son Wade Harrison as an accomplice. When Sarah walked out of the courthouse, she didn't feel triumph, she felt an immense, boundless relief, as if a crushing weight that had pressed on her for years was finally lifted. She breathed in the fresh air deeply. Beside her stood her father, holding Mike's hand. And Mike was smiling. That smile was worth more than every victory in court. 6 months passed. Life had changed beyond recognition. Margaret Harrison was under criminal investigation. She was facing real prison time, long and serious. Wade, named as an accomplice in several cases, had lost everything. He was living with distant relatives and, according to rumors, had started drinking. Barbara gave birth to a baby girl. Michael, upon hearing the news, anonymously transferred a large sum of money to her account through Robert. The child isn't guilty, he simply said. Barbara herself left for another city to start a new life. Sarah and Mike were living in her father's country house. She was finally divorced. She had taken back her maiden name, Michaelova, and she was painting again. She painted not at night, not in secret. She painted during the day, in bright sunlight. She painted furiously, pouring everything she had lived through onto the canvases. But her paintings weren't dark or frightening. On the contrary, they were full of light, full of life. They were the works of a woman who had walked through hell and survived. A woman who had found herself again. One evening her father stepped into the studio he had built for her in the garden. He stood for a long time, studying her new works. You know, he said, my restaurant is under a little renovation right now. I was thinking, the walls are empty. Sarah looked at him and smiled. That same restaurant, but the sign had changed. Now it read not Bear's Retreat but Warm Bear's Home. That was what Sarah had called her father as a child. Inside, everything was different too. Instead of dark, heavy drapes, light, airy curtains. The dim lighting had been replaced with warm, bright lights. But most important, the walls. The walls were no longer bare. They were covered with paintings. Her paintings. Bright, alive, full of light. Landscapes, portraits, abstractions. It wasn't just decoration. It was a gallery. Her own exhibition. Tonight was the grand reopening of the renovated restaurant. The hall was full of guests. Journalists, critics, friends. Sarah stood in the center of the room in a simple but elegant dress. She held Mike's hand. He proudly pointed to one of the paintings, telling the guests, my mom painted that. Her father came up and embraced her. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. Sarah looked at her paintings, at the happy faces of the guests, at her son. She remembered that terrible night, that humiliating phrase, you can't hide your peasant manners. She remembered the spit in her plate, the shredded canvases in the stairwell. They had tried to destroy her by crushing her passion, her soul. But they had achieved the opposite. They had tempered her. They had forced her to fight. and the very passion they thought was her weakness had become her greatest strength. She hadn't just gotten back her son and her name. She had gotten herself back. And now her world, her soul, her paintings hung on the walls, and people were paying money just to see them. She picked up a glass of champagne from the table, not to drink, just to hold it and watch the light sparkle in its reflection. The light of her new life. A victorious life. That's the story, dear friends. A hard, emotional, but, I believe, deeply meaningful story. A story about how behind a mask of respectability can hide the darkest vices, greed, deceit, and boundless cruelty. Tell me, do you think Margaret deserved her fate? On one hand, her fall was absolute and devastating. On the other, wasn't it just the inevitable result of her own actions? After all, every scheme, every betrayal eventually turned back on her. And what about Wade? Was he a villain, or just a pitiful, weak man crushed under his mother's power? Can weakness that leads to betraying your closest loved ones ever be forgiven? And of course, Sarah's father, Michael. He was undoubtedly a hero and savior, but his methods were harsh, almost ruthless. He didn't just defend his daughter, he systematically destroyed her enemies. Was he right to answer treachery with power and vengeance? Or was it simply an elegant, expensive revenge? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share in the comments what you think of this story and its characters. Whose actions do you justify, and whose do you condemn? If you enjoyed this story, if it touched you, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. That way you won't miss our new, equally gripping stories. Your support is the best motivation for us to keep working for you. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and may you meet only worthy and honest people on your path. All the very best to you.